This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We are at that time in Foundation's limited season where I like to take a look at some of the data and talk about cards that are being overvalued or undervalued based on how they are actually performing. As a reminder, in this kind of video, the data I'm using is all from 17 Lands. You can go to 17lands.com, sign up to have them track your Magic Arena data. And even if you don't want to sign up, you can access all of their data about cards in various limited formats. It's a really good resource. You know, it's not the end-all be-all. You shouldn't make every pick in every draft based on what card in the pack has the highest win rate. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot more than that going on. But it is a great resource, and it's only gotten better as you can use all sorts of different options for sorting, like looking at certain color pairs and stuff like that to really get a feel for, you know, where some cards work, where some cards don't. It's just a really good resource that I recommend, and it's also an interesting way to look at cards that are being undervalued and overvalued, as I like to do. And in this video, we're going to look at cards that are pretty bad, honestly, that are being taken a lot higher than they should be. This format has more cards that are like duds than we've seen in a while. I don't know if it's a return to Foundation, to a core set mentality where we used to always have, in the olden days, there were lots of unplayable, straight up unplayable cards. These days, the worst cards are less unplayable because there aren't that many that are entirely useless. But there are a lot of cards in this set still that have these really, really low win rates. It doesn't matter what deck you're playing them in. Ideally, you should never play pretty much every card we're going to look at on this list. So as usual, I like to establish a baseline that we're sort of looking at by looking at one specific card. And our baseline card this time around is Beastkin Rager. So it's being taken around pick 7.77. And it has a win rate of 55%. A reminder, that win rate's not quite as good as it seems because the average win rate for 17 Lands users is 54.5% for this limited format. So, you know, Beastkin Ranger is a solid card. I mean, honestly, as a green card with a 55% win rate, it's pretty good because there are so many bad or mediocre green cards that pull that win rate down that this is probably a little better than it looks. And that's one of the places where we can see that data isn't perfect, where you just look at win rate. When you look at the fact that green is a pretty weak color in this format, this is actually a little bit better. But the point I'm trying to make here is that every card on this list is being taken earlier than Beastkin Rager, and all of them have a lower win rate, most of them a significantly lower win rate. And you know, that's a good sign that they're overrated, right? Because it's not like Beastkin Rager is amazing. 3-mana, 3/3 trample, often attacks as a 4/3 trample and stuff like that. Like, it's a fine card, but it's not, like, amazing. And I think we can all agree about that. But you'll be surprised by some of the cards we're going to look at, probably, because of where people are taking them and what their win rate is. You'll be surprised that they are significantly worse than the Rager is. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I actually want to start with a pair of cards that are kind of interesting to me because when I did the set review, lots of people told me I was wrong about these two cards, which I gave an F to. And I thought that was funny because they're both reprints, and I know they're Fs from the other times we've seen them. And also, even if they weren't reprints, like the way these cards work just isn't good and limited these days. So they're both rares. Most of the cards in this list are commons and uncommons, but I want to talk about these two just because they always come up. Every time they're printed, people think they're really good, and they're just not. And I want to explain why in a little bit of detail. Those cards are Authority of the Consuls, which is being taken before a 5th pick and has a 52.4% win rate, and the much worse Painful Quandary, which is being taken around pick 6.9 and has a win rate of 43.8%. These two cards are definitely cards that you read, especially if you're a newer player, and they seem really sweet. Authority of the Consuls is only 1 mana, and it's easy to imagine, hey, this is going to, if I play this on turn 1, it's going to gain me life all game long, and there is a life gain deck in the format. And if I'm an aggressive life gain deck, my opponent's stuff is entering tapped, so that's going to let me attack them more effectively. With Authority, I mean, that is true. That is how Authority of the Consuls can work. But you don't always get it on turn 1. And that's really bad. Like, it's a horrible late game top deck. It's not particularly good in the mid game. And even when you do play it on turn one, there is no guarantee that it actually has a significant impact on the game in any way, shape, or form, because it doesn't really add to the board itself. If you're not already ahead, the fact that your opponent's stuff is entering tapped is irrelevant. If your opponent has a bunch of cards with haste, it gets a little more interesting, I guess, but that just doesn't happen very much. And if you always got it on turn one, it would be better, but honestly, it still wouldn't be insane because it's just not a card that does anything on its own. It needs the right situation to take over. And that's why it has a bad win rate. To be honest, 52.4% is a little higher than I'd expect, but white is one of the really good colors in the format, so it's being pulled up the same way that Beastkin Rager is being pulled down. And then Painful Quandary, yeah, it's even worse. Like, it doesn't matter when you get Painful Quandary. If you play it on 5, it's not good, and that's the earliest you can play it, generally speaking. So what's the problem here? It's kind of the same. It doesn't do anything on its own. It does put your opponent in a spot where they have to make a choice, whether they want to lose life or discard a card when they cast a spell. And that sounds, you read that and you're like, whoa, this is really strong. And I understand that. We were all new players at one point. And I can see why someone would think that. And I'm sure in a format like Commander, the Quandary is pretty good. But it doesn't do anything on its own. And the very fact that you spent 5 mana to not add to the board probably means your opponent is now ahead, and they don't really care that they have to lose life or discard a card when they cast spells, because they're already ahead on board, most likely, because they didn't do nothing with their 5 mana card. And that also means it's a lot easier for them to pay life or discard a card and not really care about that either. I've had this played against me a bunch in this format because, as the data tells us, even the players most interested in trying to win the most, who are the 17 lands users, are taking it pretty highly because it reads like it's so powerful. But I've never lost to it. I was at 2 once when my opponent played this, still didn't lose to it. And that's like the ideal situation, right? Your opponent has 5 or less life, you play this. That's like the ideal situation, and that takes a ton of setup. Still didn't lose. So, because I was so far ahead at that point that it just didn't really matter. I had cards, I drew a card every turn, so I could still cast spells, I could still use activated abilities, and I was ahead on board, so I still won in like 2 more turns because they didn't do anything for a turn. You kind of time walk yourself when you play Painful Quandary, and that's certainly what the win rate tells you, which is horrendous. Like, it's one of the lowest win rates I've ever seen on 17 lands for any format. So yeah, don't take these 2 cards highly. They're cool, rare enchantments. They read like they're awesome, but they're terrible in limited. All right, let's look at another card with a horrible win rate, even worse than most of the things on this, and that is Clinkant Sky Mage. So 48.4% win rate, and it's being taken around pick 6.4. So didn't like this in the set review, gave it a D. It's more like an F, obviously. One of the things that holds a card back in a really big way these days, especially, is just having horrible starting stats. Removal is pretty good in limited these days, and in a format like this one that has 2 1-mana removal spells that can kill your 4-mana Sky Mage, at common, by the way, it's like horribly positioned, like really badly positioned in a format like this one, but it would be pretty bad in any format. It has the potential to grow, and I love that text box. Like, I like it when a card says, when you draw a card, get a +1/+1 counter. If this was a 2-mana 1/1 with that text box, that would be an awesome card, right? Like, it still has the downside of dying. It doesn't have, I don't want to give it flying, that would make it too good. But it will grow. You get it down earlier, it's going to grow more. And it dying to a 1-mana removal spell isn't a complete disaster. Playing the Sky Mage and then it getting stabbed or burst lightninged is a disaster. That's the kind of swing that just ends a game. Like, that amount of mana equity where your opponent, you play this, your opponent has 1 mana untapped during your turn, taps it, kills your Sky Mage, untaps, and then does something real. The game's pretty much over, and that's just a huge liability. And this is something I've been talking about all the way back to the set review. When I saw that Burst Lightning and Stabber in the format, I was extra worried about everything that was a 3-mana 2/2 or a 4-mana 1/1. Anything that had that low of toughness was something I was super concerned about. And the Sky Mage was one of those cards where I was like, it's not well positioned. but I think it's even worse than I thought it was, which is why it's wild that it's being taken around pick 6.4. It does have this cool upside where if the game goes super duper long and your opponent never has any removal, it feels pretty sweet. Like this, unlike Painful Quandary, I have lost to a Sky Mage, so it happens. Every now and then it can take over a game, but it loses you the game way more often. Next, let's look at Wardens of the Cycle. So this is the black-green signpost uncommon. It's being taken around pick 6.4, has a win rate of 51.2%. So this is kind of a stand-in for like everything in the set that has Morbid. There are a few exceptions, but most of them are bad. Even the ones that looked like they might be pretty good are pretty bad. Like the 5-mana 4/5 that puts 2 counters when Morbid has happened in a turn. Like, that was one I liked in the set review. Talked about it last week. I was wrong. It's pretty bad. Wardens of the Cycle is supposed to be the card that says, look, this is what you're supposed to do in this format. You're supposed to be doing Morbid stuff in black-green, so get on it. Because I draw you an extra card every turn, or, less excitingly, gain you life. And it's got okay stats. It doesn't have the problem of low toughness on a 4-mana card or anything like that. But it's just so hard to trigger Morbid. It's an interesting mechanic because they just keep on bringing it back. And I know they don't design everything for limited, but you did design an entire archetype around it in the format by giving it a signpost uncommon, that does it. Like, you could have had Morbid on a few cards and had it not be the central mechanic for black-green, but that's what they did. And it just plays poorly in limited because it's so difficult to consistently set up. It only ever triggers during your turn, so it's not always easy to get it going. You need a sacrifice outlet of some kind, right? And you have them. Like, there's a real sacrifice theme in black in this set that is pretty legit. Like, it's one of the few synergy points that consistently comes together in the format. And yet, Wardens of the Cycle is still pretty bad, and that's because if you don't get the sacrifice stuff online at the right time for all of these Morbid cards, they're not usually doing anything, because making it so Morbid happens, like, you can't just attack your opponent and think they're going to block to trigger your Morbid. You either have to have a removal spell or a sacrifice outlet to have some control over your destiny, basically, with Morbid. And you can't do it consistently enough for almost any card with Morbid in the set to work. I think the only one that really does is the 5-mana 5/3 that comes into play and gives -1/-1 to something. But if you triggered Morbid, it's -13/-13. And I think the key there is that it still does something when you don't trigger Morbid. Something extra, right? There are lots of X1s in the format for it to kill. The other cards with Morbid, don't do their thing. Don't do anything at all unless you trigger Morbid, other than be a kind of inefficient creature or something. So, stay away from black-green as a color pair overall. It's open sometimes. I've drafted a black-green deck, but that's because I, first picked a Vivian Reed and then got a Liliana, in my second pack. That's how you end up in black-green, right? You have just, a couple insane rares in the color pair, and that's how it can happen. And, there's no color pair you stay away from entirely in the format, but there are a few that are pretty weak, and black-green's one of them. On a related note, there's also Good Fortune Unicorn, another signpost uncommon that fell really flat. It's being taken around pick 5.6, has a win rate of 51.6%. This is another card that falls into that Klinkant Sky Mage territory where it dies to a bunch of 1-mana removal, and it doesn't do anything when it enters on its own, The ability, the text box, once again, is quite good. Getting a counter on your creatures is strong, but the downside is playing a hard-to-cast Grey Ogre that does nothing on its own, and that's not a downside you can really have. And then, just like Wardens of the Cycle not being very good, sort of doomed Good Fortune Unicorn, doomed black-green to some extent, having this signpost uncommon not be very good also makes it pretty hard to willingly be in green-white. It can happen. Again, you need to get the right super powerful cards. Both colors need to be really open. But you're probably not playing Good Fortune Unicorn most of the time because it's just a liability. And you're probably not doing +1/+1 counter stuff that much either in green-white. Overall, this format, in terms of synergy, it's kind of not really there. Like I said, the sacrifice thing is legit in a lot of black decks. In black-red, it can get especially nasty. And in black-white, the life gain theme is pretty legit. Those are ones where the payoffs are all, reasonable, and you have enough ways to trigger them that things work out okay. Red-green, to a lesser extent, can work out. That's the 4-power theme, but there are a bunch of cards, even in that color pair, that are kind of duds. One of them being Garruk's Uprising, which I want to talk about next. This one's a reprint, one that I didn't like because it wasn't good in any of the other times we've seen it. It's not good here either. It's taken around pick 6.5, has a win rate of 51.5%. This, I do think you can play sometimes. So far, I don't think we've talked about any cards that you really can. So that's a thumbs up. I think people are playing it too much. If you have the right deck, where you really got there on like cheap 4-power creatures like the Cerberus, the 2-mana 4/2, and the 3-mana 4/2 flash thing, you can kind of get away with this as an okay build around. It's still like a build around C. The problem, which is similar to Authority of the Consuls and Painful Quandary, is that it doesn't do anything on its own most of the time. It can draw you a card when it enters, unlike some other versions of this effect we've seen, and that does save it a little bit. But you do have to have a big enough creature in play. That's far from guaranteed. One of the downsides of playing those 4/2s that deck is often reliant upon to really get going with a card like Garruk's Uprising is, guess what? They die to Burst Lightning and Stab. That really keeps those cards in check in a big way. So you just end up not adding to the board. Even if you draw a card, you're not adding to the board when you play Uprising. There are times where you get it late, it gives your whole board trample, bam, you win the game, right? But it's a bad card most of the time. It's another card I've seen played a ton, like I have the Quandary, and I haven't lost to once, because it gives you the same kind of advantage. It's not quite as useless as the Quandary, but you need to have just the right deck to play this card. Occasionally, there's a deck that works for it, but 9 times out of 10, probably more like, 98 times out of 100, you shouldn't be playing Garruk's Uprising. It just doesn't do what you need it to. If you do want to play the red-green Power 4 or greater deck, which I think is a solid deck, it's probably the best of the green decks in the format, you do have 2 nice 2-drops that are creatures, and that's what makes a big difference. You've got the 2-mana 2/2 that when it attacks gets +1/+0 in Menace if you have a 4-power or more thing, and even better, you have the 2-mana 2/2 Beetle, which was great last time we saw it, and it's great here, that gets a counter every combat if you have a Power 4 or greater creature. And eventually it counts itself because it gets to Power 4 or greater. Like, those 2 cards are sort of the backbone of good red-green decks in the format, where you've got like 2 of each of those, and then some reasonable 4-power creatures hanging out in your deck. Like, that works out. But you don't want to be doing Garruk's Uprising. You want payoffs that are, at worst, 2-mana 2/2s that actually add to the board on their own, and you don't really want a payoff that does nothing on its own. All right, now let's talk about a couple of dragons. One of them's rare, the other is not, and those cards are Niv-Mizzet Visionary and Shivan Dragon. So these cards, the Visionary is taken around pick 3.7, has a win rate of 46.5%. Brutal. Not as bad as Painful Quandary, though. And Shivan Dragon is being taken around pick 7.45 and has a win rate of 50.3%. So these 2 cards are super emblematic of how good removal in the format is, too. Like, I didn't like any of these that much in the set review, but I didn't think either of them are basically cards you should avoid, either. I thought, it's interesting because this set being a core set to some extent had me thinking, big creatures that have nice stats are going to be a little better than they have been lately. And while I accounted for like the cheap removal being really good in the format, obviously, like I think overall I did a good job of that in the set review, the Stab Burst Lightning thing, I didn't account for how much good removal there is that just straight up kills creatures for like 3 or 4 mana. And there is a bunch of that between Hero's Downfall and Banishing Light, Uncharted Voyage to a lesser extent. I mean, it still does the job. There's just a bunch of it. There's a bunch in the format that can just deal with creatures, and so it's kind of a liability to play any 6-mana, big, expensive 6-mana creature like these who are basically just stats and hope it's going to go okay. And that's why these have such low win rates. It's the same kind of problem where the 1-mana things are killing 3 and 4-mana cards. That's going to win people the game. Well, you playing a Niv-Mizzet Visionary and your opponent casting Bake into a Pie on it, or Hero's Downfall, those things are also kind of game ending. And yeah, Niv Mizzet Visionary has some more text, and there are some ways you can get it going, but the blue-red spells deck rarely comes together that well. It's another one of these synergy points that doesn't really get there. This format's not huge on synergy. It's there, but most of the cards that support it aren't that good, and that hurts Niv Mizzet Visionary as well. Shivan Dragon is just a big stats creature that costs too much for what it is in today's limited environments. Speaking of dragons and cards that pay you off for doing spell stuff, I want to also talk about Fire Spitter Whelp. It's being taken around pick 6.8, has a win rate of 51.4%. This looks like it would be okay to me, even though this is one that I didn't account enough for Burst Lightning and Stab, I guess. But yeah, it has that problem. It has the Burst Lightning and Stab problem, and where it dies to those very easily. And then it also pays you off for something like Niv Mizzet Visionary, which they do combo together. It does pay you off for something that just isn't that easy to actually make come together. I mean, I talked last week about how Tolarian Terror largely doesn't work in this format. And it was really great last time we saw it. That's a good sign that deck really isn't working, as is Fire Spitter Whelp's situation. All right, let's wrap things up with Aetherize, which is being taken around pick 7.37 and has a win rate of 50%. So, this card is another one of these cards where you read it and, like with Authority of the Consuls and Painful Quandary, and you imagine these awesome situations for it where it just destroys people. Like they cast Overrun, right? And then you cast Aetherize, and it's pretty much game over. Problem is, those situations are few and far between. In fact, Overrun is just like a solid card in the set. It doesn't help that green isn't great, but, it's just a solid card. It's not like a format-defining card or anywhere close to it. If it were, maybe Aetherize would be better, but it's not. And most of the time, Aetherize is never a card, almost never, a card that gives you a full card of value in the sense that it just bounces stuff. Right? And most of the time, because, or all the time really, because you have to cast it during your opponent's combat for it to do something, your opponent just casts the creature again. So if you're spending 4 to bounce a creature, one creature, that's not good. Also, all the stuff with Enter the Battlefield abilities in the format is perfectly okay with the idea of getting bounced and your opponent recasting it. And even when you do bounce their whole board, like it's an alpha strike and it buys you a turn, it's just a 4-mana fog. And fogs are notoriously terrible in Limited because they have the same narrow use case that something like Aetherize does. It's great when your opponent swings out and you have lethal on your board too if you survive their attack, but that comes together rarely. And honestly, fog might be a little bit better because your opponent doesn't get to recast the things untapped, right? So... or get into the battlefield abilities or anything like that. So Aetherize is just a really bad card. It has an effect that looks powerful and sounds powerful, especially for an uncommon, but it is too narrow. Most of the time, you're bouncing 2 things, and that's not good enough. And it's actively bad in many situations too, as I've already explained. So yeah, I mean, Aetherize shouldn't be being taken around pick 7.37. Shouldn't be being played in your main deck at all. If you play against a green deck that has Overrun and Preposterous Proportions or something, okay, I'd probably side one in. But there aren't that many green decks that are going to have both of those cards and be built around using those to win. So yeah, it's just a bad card. It's one that's easy to overrate, but as the win rate would tell you, it's not good. It's not a card you should be playing basically ever. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Most of the time when I do these, I exaggerate a little in the title when I say stop playing these cards. Most of the time, the reality is don't play these as much as you are. Don't pick these as highly as you are. It's not nearly as catchy of a title. This time around, I think pretty much every card on this list is a card you should never play at least 99% of the time. That's how bad they are. Which again is interesting that this set doesn't have as many cards that are well, people are probably playing it too much and that's why it has a low win rate. It just has a lot of cards in it that are liabilities or actively bad compared to what we've seen in Limited lately. Next week, we'll look at the opposite end of the spectrum. We'll look at cards that are being underrated based on how well they're performing. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description.